figure out the Be Live thing and the Facebook Live thing, and I think I'm kind of closing in on it. Who knows? I just want to kind of share some of the stories of New Orleans until I can share them in person. So my name is Libby. My company is Lucky Bean Tours, and we give walking tours, small group walking tours of New Orleans for those of you who haven't been on one of these before, and tell the stories about this place that we love. And right now we can't tell them to our visitors in person, but there's people all over the world I know that are interested in New Orleans. And we're going to get a chance to tell them these stories here. So today we're going to look at, let's see, and show and screen. Today we're going to look at Storyville and the birthplace of jazz. So Storyville was a notorious red light district in New Orleans that existed from about 1897 to 1917, so a 20-year period right at the turn of the last century. And it was a red light district, and we all know what that means: prostitution, gambling, liquor, vice district, basically. But many other cities have had vice districts throughout the past and even do today. But I think what makes this one unique and why we keep telling those stories over and over again, and they make movies out of it, and it's because it spawned this wonderful and unique American art form, which is, of course, jazz music. So, okay, so I'm going to move on into talking about Storyville, and we will get to jazz eventually, but I'll kind of give you a little background on how Storyville came to be. So let me switch it around to, there we go. So this is a picture of New Orleans in the 1890s. So 1890s is 30 years after the Civil War. And if you've been in on any of our other talks, you know that the Civil War had a major, major impact. It was a huge turning point. I say all the time, it was the Louisiana Purchase, the Civil War, and Hurricane Katrina that had the biggest impacts on shifts, cultural shifts in New Orleans and the way that we live. And so the Civil War leaves us pretty much devastated, impoverished. By the way, if anybody's here, please say something so I know that you're here, because so far I don't see anybody. So we become really, really impoverished. We had been completely reliant on sugar and cotton for our economy. And of course, those crops were heavily reliant on the labor of enslaved people, and the enslaved people were freed, and we have these political problems and racism, infrastructure problems. No one's investing in this war-torn, politically volatile region that suffers from flooding all the time. So we remain pretty impoverished. So about 30 years after the Civil War, the city leaders and the outcry of the public is do something. We have to have some kind of economy. We have to get people down here to invest and open factories and bring jobs. And this is sort of what was happening in the 1890s. Every account you read coming out of New Orleans in the 1890s is them trying to be bright and positive. Oh, it's not as bad as it seems. You know, I mean, yeah, yellow fever, but we're working on it. And so this is a picture of Canal Street in the 1890s. We had, oops, clicking on the wrong one. We had riots, racism. This is blood flows in New Orleans, murdered by the mob. So it's really, really volatile time in our history, and everyone in the country knew it. Yellow fever was killing entire families. We have this tropical diseases. It wasn't until the early 1900s that they proved that it was the Aedes aegypti mosquito and began eradicating breeding sites for the mosquitoes. But at this point, this mysterious scourge would come upon New Orleans just about every summer. And we had the largest mass lynching in American history was in 1890. 11 Sicilians were lynched right outside of the city jail, which is the story for something for another Facebook Live one day. But anyway, the reputation was there as New Orleans was out of control mob of vigilantes. And it was also it was very, very poor. This is a picture of the French Quarter from the turn of the last century. Very, very impoverished. And we are known for being poor, politically volatile, and no one wants to invest in this place. Also, it was the Victorian age. And so there was a lot of movements, the sobriety, the temperance movements, religious zeal about being clean and being morally upright. And New Orleans, it's hard to believe, but kind of was known as the city of vice. And it was known that you could get prostitutes, you could get drugs, you could get opium, liquor, gamble in New Orleans. It was like a free for all. So the city has to do something to attract Northeastern capital down here, to get people to come here, open factories, and kind of get our economy going. But we can't get rid of vice. They knew that they were not going to be able to get rid of it. So they came up with this brilliant idea of actually trying to contain it. Oh, I'm moving my, oh, there we go. And oops. And this is their idea. So it was called Storyville. They said, let's create this red light district, 20 blocks. There's actually 38 blocks, but they divided, of course, Black Storyville and White Storyville. And the one we're going to talk about here is the White Storyville, because this is sort of where all this action kind of happens. So 20 blocks, and really it was 16 blocks, because 4 of the blocks you can see right here. There's one there, one there, one there, one there that look different because those were cemeteries. So basically we have the railroad tracks down here, cemeteries right here. We have a canal right there. So it's not prime real estate. And they're like, look, all of that stuff can happen in that little area. And the rest of the city is going to be squeaky clean, and everybody will adhere to this. And so technically, like, contrary to popular belief, it wasn't a legalized prostitution district. It was just simply illegal everywhere else. And that was kind of the gray area, and everybody was going to look the other way. And so this notorious red light district sprouts up overnight. And they name it Storyville because the man who was kind of like the moral, like, he's going to crack down on upright Victorian gentleman that's going to crack down on this scourge once and for all. His name was Sidney Story. He was a city alderman. And to kind of thumb their nose at him, they named it Storyville, which I'm sure irked him until his dying day. So Storyville it was. This was the area. And there was something for every budget in Storyville, from the cribs. And this is a picture of them right before they were going to be demolished. But you can see they were called cribs or nickel cribs. And so basically this is budget prostitution. There's just like a little room there and a little cot. And so you can fill in with your imagination that this was definitely a very, like, if you had a nickel, this is what we have for you over here. And then they had the sporting palaces, and basically on Basin Street, so right in front of you can see that the railroad tracks runs in front of these. So they're beautiful Victorian 4 or 5 stories, sometimes buildings, but they're right there in front of the railroad tracks. So it's this, they were called sporting palaces. And so this is the premiere of prostitution. This is the fancy place. This is equivalent to gentlemen's clubs versus strip joints. So they were fine liqueurs and gambling tables and beautiful women and chandeliers and mirrored ballrooms and all the way. And here are this is a picture of some of the sporting palaces right here. This is, I believe, Josie Arlington's place. This would be a parlor, a room where they would come, a well-appointed room where the men would wait. And you can see, the finest of everything, velvet drapes and beautiful chandeliers, and definitely the best. And this is the sort of, this is the street. This is Basin Street, another angle of Basin Street right here. So right in the middle, somebody had a little bit more of a humble cottage. She wasn't selling out. She was like, no, this is all we need, just the basics. Y'all can get all fancy, but I'm sticking with my cottage. And this is where these are some of the people who ran these sporting palaces. This is Josie Arlington. This is Tom Anderson. They called the mayor of Storyville. This is Lulu White. So these were 3 of the people that sort of ran these establishments. And the way they advertised was in these blue books. So when a gentleman would get off of the train in New Orleans, some little boy would probably run up to him and give him a blue book. And that would tell him exactly you know, what was available, what the specialty of the house was, what the visiting performers, who the visiting performers were, and kind of he could pick where he wanted to go. So they would advertise, put pictures of the girls. These are kind of rare because these guys didn't always take them home with them. They would throw them in the trash before they got on the train to go back home. But a couple of years ago, Pamela Arsenault with the Historic New Orleans Collection wrote a book called The Guidebooks to Sin. It's really, really interesting. And these are some pictures of the girls of Storyville. I love this one. This one's famous. I love her striped tights. I also love her table, and I actually have the same table from, I think, probably about 1905. So I think that that was just a popular table at the time. And most of these photographs were taken by a photographer named E.J. Belloc, who this was sort of like his secret hobby. Like he mostly took real estate photographs at the turn of the last century, but he would spend a lot of his days off, it appears, in Storyville, getting to know the girls, taking pictures of them. And they were kind of like kept secret. He wouldn't show them. And his, I think some of them were discovered after his death. But in the 1970s, a photographer in New York City found a whole box of his glass slides and did a, hey, Marty's here, and did a great expo of them, and they're just really great photographs. And this lady just had her little pillow collection. I like her with her pillow collection. And here's another one. So these were the Storyville girls, the women who worked in Storyville, but they needed music. So the madams, the landladies of these houses, they would hire musicians. And they're hiring mostly Black musicians. This is Kid Ory's band in 1905 that we're looking at right here. They're hiring musicians, and they're like, look, guys, don't play anything fancy, like not what you get for your regular paying gigs. This is not some ball. We don't want you to show off your fancy skills. It's a cat house. And so we need something a little funky, a little fun to get the guys up and, you know, moving and dancing and buying drinks for the girls and coming back night after night. And the musicians obliged with this type of music that they usually called ratty music or gut bucket music. It gives you an idea of how, that's the nicknames for it, how low class they considered it at the time. It was like music that you would play with your friends after your gig was over, and you would loosen up your tie, have a couple of beers, and start just playing, sort of like improvising off of each other. And it felt good, but it was not considered respectable music. So they now have this awesome venue to play it in. So to say, and even I named this Facebook Live event The Birth of Jazz, it's really kind of incorrect because it was born in Africa hundreds of years before, and all of these other influences come together to create the New Orleans jazz sound. So it really, but you can say that it flourished and it found a home and a venue in Storyville in the early 1900s. So here's a band. So this goes back a little bit, a neighborhood, an area in town that we call Congo Square, which is called Congo Square now officially. It's in Armstrong Park, and it's also near where that prison was, where they had that riot in 1890 and killed all those Sicilians. But this is where the Africans would gather together on Sundays during the colonial period, when the enslaved Africans did have the day off. Now, I want to clarify, I have no doubt that out on the plantations where everybody wasn't like watching each other all the time, that they certainly did not give the enslaved Africans the day off. But in the city where everybody was kind of looking at each other all the time, I think that it was pretty much the norm for the Africans to gather together without any white people around. 700-800 people gathered together on Sundays. And what are you going to do on Sundays? You're going to keep your culture alive. You're going to baptize your babies. You're going to say the words and tell the stories and cook the dishes and eat the foods of Africa and of your culture. And there's little moments of hope, because on that one day, you were away from your regular life of enslaved person. And in moments of hope, there's always going to be music. So the African people brought the banjo, they brought the djembe drum, and they would play music and dance on Congo Square, so that their African music did not die. It was kept alive on Sundays. So a combination of the African rhythms, which had been in New Orleans since the earliest days, And these kind of bawdy dances that were happening, not vaudeville, excuse me, ragtime music was becoming, the original risque music that your parents didn't want you to look at or listen to. And this was happening all over the country. So the vaudeville, excuse me, I keep calling it vaudeville, ragtime rhythms, African rhythms, the fact that we had been an occupied city for 15 years by the Union Army, a lot of brass instruments lying around could be had for cheap at pawn shops, kind of leads to this interesting sound. And the first, I think they say that he kind of gave birth to jazz music, was this man, Buddy Bolden. And this is the only known picture of Buddy Bolden. He's the third from the left on the back row. Buddy Bolden unfortunately died in a mental institution, but he was the one that would boldly play that music. Like, there was nothing subdued about Buddy Bolden. He was like playing his horn. The whole town could hear him. And so this kind of jazz music creeps up. Jelly Roll Morton is also an early jazz musician. His name was Ferdinand Lamoth. He called himself Jelly Roll Morton. There's a little bit of risque. That's a pretty risque nickname. Anyway, he played the piano in Storyville, later became a real famous jazz musician and claimed that he invented jazz. So these were the guys that were playing, and it was awesome. Everybody wanted to come here and, hear this music. There were actually people that came just for the music, and they'd say, you got to come on up to Chicago, New York, LA, spread this jazz throughout the world. And these guys are like, no way, man. I'm making money hand over fist. I'm surrounded by naked ladies. I'm going to stay here where I am. And so jazz stayed very, very local for about 20 years. And so this is Sidney Bechet, Bunk Johnson, Joe Oliver, some of the early jazz musicians. But in 1917, this is where Storyville's going to end, right? Because we are entering World War I, and everybody's being recruited. And we have 4 local naval training camps, and about a dozen within a day's train ride, and almost everybody was shipping out of New Orleans. In the entire bottom half of the country, they were shipping out of New Orleans. And so the U.S. Department of the Navy doesn't want a notorious red light district right next door to where they're training their boys to ship out to the war. So by order of the U.S. Navy, Storyville is shut down in 1917. The houses are boarded up. Nobody was even allowed to live there. And of course, a lot of the actual jazz musicians were signing up. There was a huge push to recruit Black men into the military. And unfortunately, there was sort of the unspoken promise that, that life will be better for you once you serve your country. And we know that didn't turn out to be the case. So Storyville is shut down. And here is a picture of them in later years actually tearing Storyville down. Anyway, the musicians themselves are out of work, and they start leaving town. They're going up to Chicago, New York, out to LA, spreading jazz throughout the world. And that is how jazz leaves New Orleans. Now, of course, it's changed much. It's changed a lot. And there's all different types of jazz, which is wonderful. It's an organic organism that kind of keeps changing and growing. However, the original Dixieland jazz, it is not that smooth, mellow, cool cat jazz like Miles Davis, which is wonderful, but it's brassy and it's energetic, and it's made to want to make you feel something and get up and dance. And so that is where jazz was born. So eventually, jazz spreads throughout the world, and Storyville is torn down. And the soldiers are coming back from World War I. It was the most traumatic, this huge cases of what they called shell shock, we call PTSD now, is coming about because of World War I. It was a tragic, scary war. There were bombs dropping from the sky. It was absolutely, of course, also, we keep talking about now, the influenza epidemic was killing people off. It was a grim, grim time. And when they emerged from that time in the in the 1920s, the youth wants something new and fresh. They want to move on. They want to be happy. Women are going to work. Women's skirts are coming up. They're cutting their hair. And so they need a soundtrack for that generation. And jazz definitely became it. Look at the Flappers. So these girls are completely different than their mothers, in their minds at least, and they want to have a good time. So F. Scott Fitzgerald writes in 1920, he writes Tales of 22, 20 or 22, writes Tales of the Jazz Age, and he gives that name to that generation. They were the Jazz Age. And so it explodes. At the same time, they're finding ways of recording music that everybody can have. You can buy a Victrola, you can have a record and play this music. And actually the first, and playing it in dance halls. This is a jazz band in Chicago in the 1920s. Jelly Roll Morton becomes famous. Ferdinand Morton, he's calling himself right there, the Jelly Roll Blues. And jazz musicians become huge. Nick LaRocca and his band, who were a bunch of Italian guys out of New Orleans, were the first recorded jazz musicians in 1917. It could have been a black man named Freddie Keppert, but he didn't want to commit his original scores onto onto the records to be recorded because he was afraid people would steal his music. But the most famous person ever to come out of this has got to be Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was from New Orleans. He was born here in 1901 and the son of a very poor woman who probably worked in Storyville now and then herself. And he was, you know, a kid running around in the streets. And in 1913, when he was 13 years old, on New Year's Eve, he got caught firing a gun into the air to celebrate New Year's Eve. No one got hurt, but he did get caught, and he had to spend a year in the Colored Waifs home for boys. And he's very depressed and down in the dumps. This is believed, where I'm kind of circling with my mouse here, is believed to be the oldest known picture of Louis Armstrong. And this man right here is Peter Davis, and Peter Davis would come and mentor the boys and teach them how to play music. And this is a great, you know, skill for these boys to have, especially in a city like New Orleans. And he teaches them how to play the cornet, that short little trumpet he played until 1926. And he was, of course, a marvel at it. And he began playing music on the streets for money even before he got out of the home. And he would bring the money back to the home and they would use it to buy more instruments. And so when he gets out, he goes to work in Storyville. But when Storyville shuts down in 1917, he's only 16 years old. He's kind of too young to go out on his own. So he stays in New Orleans for 5 years, working on the steamboats. That's where he learns actually how to play music on these, like, steamboats would have bands and dances on the boats. He worked as a banana man, unloading the bananas from the ships that were coming up from South America. Worst job ever. He said that he wrote in his biography that the rats would make their home nest in the banana bunches on their way over. And when he would grab that banana bunch, he would wake up the rats and they would go down his sleeves, and he just went back to playing music, thank goodness. So in 1922, he gets a telegram from Joe Oliver asking him to come up to Chicago and play second cornet in his band. He's like, we're making good money, come on up and play. You know, I got you a place to stay, I got you a band, got you a job. So he goes up there in 1922 to play with his mentor, Joe Oliver, who absolutely loved. And this is the band. He later on marries the piano player. This is the Joe Oliver band in the 1920s. And he becomes world famous. I mean, we know, look, here he is with Bing Crosby, Grace Kelly, and Frank Sinatra. Here he is somewhere in there. There he is playing. So he becomes world famous. He plays all over the world. Definitely the most famous person that's ever been from New Orleans. And at one point he comes back to New Orleans and he's playing a concert. And he, afterwards, a man from the Louisiana State Museum comes to him and he says, we have this horn that we've been told was your horn at one time, but we're having trouble verifying it. Can you help us? And he's like, yeah, you know, bring it tomorrow. I'll see what you got, see what I can do. So the young man comes the next day from the State Museum and he shows him this beat up old horn, and he looks at it for just a second. He's like, yeah, that's it. That's my first horn from the home. He said, me and music got married in that home. It meant so much to him. And he said, how'd you know? And he said, I was trying to get this specific sound, and I took a hacksaw and cut some grooves into the mouthpiece, and those are my cuts. So all those years later, he recognized the horn, and it's in the Louisiana State Museum. The Mint Museum is now the U.S. Mint Jazz Museum, and they have the horn on display under glass. And you look carefully, you can see tiny little grooves in the mouthpiece, and you're like, wow, those are the cuts that a little kid named Louis Armstrong cut. So he did a lot for New Orleans, a lot for jazz, a lot for African Americans. He was the first Black superstar to say that he would not play in a hotel that would not have him as a guest. And so that was a wonderful, bold statement. This is what the U.S. Mint Museum looks. So when you get here for your vacation, you can come and see Satchmo's horn. And this is the area where Storyville becomes the Iberville housing projects. And this is a picture from the early 60s when it was integrated. And this lady's having like story time with the children in the neighborhood. So it's right on the edge of the French Quarter housing projects. Eventually, they became pretty blighted, as housing projects tended to do, especially in the 1980s and 1990s. And then this is an aerial view of the housing project. So you can see this is the downtown area, Canal Street. This is the French Quarter right here, the Mississippi River, St. Louis Cemetery #1, and Storyville. And then the housing projects were kind of nestled in here. This is St. Louis Cemetery #2. So that's the area where Storyville was at one time. Post Katrina, it became they renovated it. This is what it looks like now. It's called the Bienville Basin, But of course, street music, street musicians, right in Jackson Square, people are playing wonderful jazz all the time. You can hear it every single day in there. Another great place where they love to play jazz is under the Claiborne Overpass, right on the edge of the area that was Storyville and the housing projects is this overpass. Unfortunately, an ugly interstate runs right through the middle of this beautiful old neighborhood, kind of blighting it forever and ever. And you can hear jazz being played under the overpass. It's a really neat acoustic sound. And look at these. I just wanted to show you this because this is a local brass band. But look, these aren't old guys. So when you think of jazz, a lot of people think of like a bunch of old guys sitting around playing jazz, but it's young. I mean, it's alive. Young people are playing jazz even today. Preservation Hall Jazz Band. You can hear great Dixieland jazz. So in the 1950s, so this guy on the far left, Ben Jaffe, his parents came here in the 1950s. I think they were from Indiana. And they were, beatniks and hanging out and being cool. And they had a little art gallery there, and they played these jazz shows and realized that the early original jazz musicians were all kind of dying off. So they turned it into the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, dedicated to preserving that original Dixieland jazz. And their son, Ben, owns it and runs it and is in the band today. So really good jazz that's being played every night at Preservation Hall. And then, of course, Armstrong Park on the edge of the French Quarter is named after the beloved Louis Armstrong. And the Armstrong International Airport that was called Moisant Field, and it was renamed the Louis Armstrong International Airport in 2001 to honor Satchmo's 100th birthday. And here's a statue of Louis and Mr. Armstrong, Louis Armstrong in Armstrong Park. Also, when they were demolishing the Iberville housing projects after Hurricane Katrina, they discovered artifacts from Storyville, and they did an archaeological dig. So if you walk over there now, there's this one area, and here's a picture of it, where it is fenced off, and there's these big panels that tells you about what was in that neighborhood at one time and some of the artifacts that they discovered, like a ginger beer bottle, a porcelain jar, a pipe bowl, and there's a key from an accordion. So they're going to do, I think, a little museum on that property right there. So that's the legacy of jazz and Storyville and Satchmo. By the way, he got his nickname Satchmo because he had that big old mouth, and when he would run home after after his gigs, and he would put all his tips in his mouth, which in those days was, nickels and dimes, and to protect him so that he wouldn't get robbed. And he would run home as fast as he could, and they called him Satchel Mouth. And that's how he got his name. Anyway, thanks everybody for tuning in. if you get a chance, go on the Lucky Bean Tours Facebook page and tell us, what else you would like to hear about, because I think we'll be doing these for a while. I think the state's going to open up, but in a really, really slow, phased way. So it'll be a while before we're too busy to do these. So we might as well tell these stories. Thanks, everybody. Bye.